Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar. My name is Calvin Sharfs and I'm the VP of Product Marketing at Pixalate. Today we are co-presenting Fraud Finding Supply Path Optimization Tips for 2022 with Basis Technology, a global automation software provider and enterprise marketers. We'll introduce our panelists in just a moment. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. We will answer as many questions at the end of the webinar as possible. Now, without further ado, we will do some quick introductions of the panelists. First, I will have Amit introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amit Shetty. I'm the VP of Product at Pixalate. And I should say, prior to joining Pixalate, I was working at the Tech Lab for about 5 years. So I likely will be switching hats back and forth as we go through the conversation today. And happy to be here.
And Ian, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Certainly. I'm Ian Trider. I'm the VP of RTB Platform Operations at Basis Technologies, formerly Centro. I'm also a member of the commit group for Programmatic Supply Chain Working Group, which develops the OpenRTB standard, as well as sellers JSON and supply chain object, ads TXT, and all those things.
Great, thank you very much. We'll do just a really quick agenda. We'll talk a little bit about Pixalate and a quick slide on that. We'll do the same with Basis. And Ian will give a little introduction with what they do. Then we want to jump over to Ian talking about how Basis looks at the supply philosophy that we're looking at today and how they are using SPO and supply chain object to help their ad fraud efforts. We'll also then kind of go through how it works, the ad fraud and supply paths, how that works through the chain, so to speak. We'll give a little bit of an SEO background. We'll talk about what Pixalate is doing to help prevent ad fraud through SPO in 2021 and 2022. We'll talk a few minutes about the future of what we see with SPO, what we might be able to do with it. We've gotten some preliminary insights that we'll be talking about. And then again, we'll jump into the Q&A. Pixalate, I'll do the quick introduction for Pixalate. So Pixalate is a global market-leading fraud protection, privacy, COPPA, and compliance analytics platform. We span across CTV, mobile advertising, and desktop. We are a global company. We just did an expansion in EMEA, so including London, LA, Palo Alto, New York, and Singapore is where we have our offices, as well as workers and clients from around the world. We have one product called Media Ratings Terminal. It's an ad supply chain intelligence. It's where you can look up any app or domain and gain insights. That's a free product that you can go look at. We also do a publisher rankings on the quality of programmatic advertising. It does measurements on brand safety, IVT, viewability, and others. We also have a fraud protection through pre-bid lists and analytics monitoring. So that's two separate products, a pre-bid listing and compliance analytics. We are MRC accredited across desktop, mobile in-app, and CTV, and we are the only company with SSAI measurement metrics accredited by the MRC. We have lots of posts on our blog and website and many research reports and also a YouTube channel if you're interested in any of these findings with video. And we will turn time over to Ian to introduce himself and his company.
Thank you. Yes, as noted before, I'm Ian Trider from Basis Technologies, which until a few weeks ago was Centro. So Basis Technologies is a global automation software provider for enterprise marketers, as mentioned. We bring together programmatic, site direct, advanced TV, search, and social together through a single interface to allow marketers and agencies to streamline their operations and consolidate tools and systems. We're headquartered in Chicago, but we have 34 offices across the US, Canada, Mexico, and Argentina. I'm based in Toronto. And we partner with Pixalate for pre-bid fraud prevention, fraud monitoring and viewability measurement in our DSP, which was rated #1 on G2 Crowd for 16 consecutive quarters. So I'd like to first talk about how we think about supply selection and how we think about curating the supply available through our DSP. So one of the most important underlying principles that we go by when thinking about what supply to accept and what not is that it's incredibly important to know where supply comes from. So to explain that, let me first say at a high level, you can think of there being two ways that fraud enters the RTB ecosystem. Fraud can be initiated by a publisher, so they could be sourcing bad traffic, or they could be hiding ad units or engaging in some other sort of bad activity. But fraud can also be introduced by intermediaries who are involved in the chain of custody or the supply path, the sell inventory. Now, without first ruling out whether fraud is introduced by intermediaries, we won't be able to work out whether an apparent case of fraud is in fact a problem caused by the publisher or if it's bad intermediaries in between. So first we need to rule out bad intermediaries, and so we need to buy only from trusted supply paths. Ultimately, what we're seeking to do is maximize our customers' working media and minimize their fraud risk. And by that I mean maximize the amount of their spend that goes to actual media, that goes to the publisher instead of going to unnecessary middlemen. And we do this by requiring that bid requests are transparent, traceable, and accurate, meaning they have the information we need to be able to follow it back to the source through however many parties it passed through. And that includes things like the supply chain object. We also want to avoid unnecessary indirection and duplication. And I'll talk more about this in a minute, but there is indeed quite a lot of that in the R2B ecosystem, and better value for customers can be achieved by avoiding it. So supply chain object and other tools like ads.txt and sellers JSON are essential tools for us to do this supply curation. On the next slide, I'll talk a bit more about what I mean about these unnecessarily indirect and duplicative supply paths. So in a simple world, in an ideal world, things kind of look like this. You have publishers who work directly with ad exchanges or SSPs. And those ad exchanges or SSPs work with DSPs, and the advertisers or their agency works with the DSP. And it's nice and simple, and it's easy to follow the money. But in the real world, it turns out to not be quite so simple. So in the real world, as the next slide shows, there are in many cases a large web of intermediaries involved in bringing ad impressions to market. So a publisher might work with some sort of ad network or SSP, and that ad network or SSP might not be directly integrated with ad exchanges. It might work with another entity who is integrated with ad exchanges, and the inventory will make it through DSPs that way. Now, this isn't always a bad thing. So there's some types of intermediaries that provide value to the market by connecting small publishers. So, for example, consider small publishers like a recipe blog. They're not necessarily big enough to have direct access to the ad exchanges. And so these intermediaries can act as an aggregator that works with a large number of these small blogs and creates enough volume that collectively that intermediary can get a seat on an ad exchange to sell on behalf of those publishers. And that's valuable. But there are also a lot of cases of intermediaries just reselling to each other. Many smaller exchanges might have direct integrations with some DSPs, but also be integrated with several other larger exchanges to help bring inventory to market. And so that creates a scenario where there are a great deal of redundant paths where the exact same impressions and the exact same opportunities arrive at the DSP in multiple ways, except some of those times it's an unnecessarily indirect path. as well, this indirection creates a lot of opportunities for bad actors to hide, because some of these intermediaries may be accepting traffic for a given website or app from multiple different sources. Maybe some of those sources are genuine traffic direct from the publisher, and maybe some of them are spoofed, invalid traffic. And a challenge here is that, you know, these intermediaries will often ask for publishers to list quite a lot of accounts in their ads.txt file, the accounts that the intermediary directly holds on exchanges, anybody who they want to resell the supply through. And ads.txt has been incredibly effective at reducing the danger of spoofing, but you have to keep in mind that when something is put in an ads.txt file, it is an endorsement to allow somebody to claim to sell inventory for that domain or app, not actually sell it, claim to sell it. So if entities are listed indiscriminately, it creates an opportunity for bad actors to take advantage of that and supply inventory to these intermediaries who may not be so choosy and may be willing to accept supply from multiple different paths. And so it provides opportunities and risks for intermediary-based fraud to sneak into the ecosystem. But there is some tooling that can help identify this, as well as just generally help in identifying unnecessarily circuitous or indirect supply paths. And next, Amit will be talking about supply chain object, which is existing precisely to help with that.
Thanks, Ian. This is the point where I put on my Tech Lab hat and talk about history, if you will. What you saw with the previous slide that Ian was walking us through, the complexity is kind of obvious, right? So you have all these different paths that can be taken for any given transaction. But I think the other aspect to that is really the challenge that we've had in the industry is the lack of transparency around this exact scenario, right? So it's bad enough that it is so complex, but to make things even more difficult there has been a lack of information that allows you to see exactly what happened as a transaction went through all these different hops, and that is where the supply chain object really came in. The way to look at the supply chain object, I like to think of ads.txt and sellers.json as being the declarative transparency standards, right? So basically, entities declare what the relationships are with each other, while the supply chain object is more transactional transparency standard, where you're looking at the transaction, and during the transaction you are talking about every entity is adding information about themselves to the standard. And the standard itself is very straightforward. It's an extension to OpenRTB, though you can also pass in that information through other protocols as well. You basically provide information about yourself. You talk about what the seat ID is, and so on. And this is launched back in 2018, and I think it's very important to know that, and it ties into what we had the conversation today. We're seeing a lot of traction now at this point in time, and that's the reason why this is more and more important right now. So you go to the next slide, Calvin. This is a simple representation of how it works, right? So as the bid request goes through each hop, that entity adds information about itself to that to the bid request in that extension. And as you can see that as the transaction goes through the chain, the information gets more and more gets richer and richer. It also includes information about, it also includes a flag that talks about completeness. So the idea is that when an entity starts adding itself into the supply chain object, it checks whether the previous entity has provided information or not, and then based on that, it's going to set that flag before it passes it along to the next one. The other interesting aspect of this is that while the DSP, the end of the chain, is going to be the place which has the the most amount of information about that chain, because that's the end of the chain. It is still useful for the other entities to basically look at to have that information, to be able to analyze that information and take actions based on the information they do have. So I wouldn't. One of the things which I have been asked before is this useful only for the DSPs? And I think the answer is no. It is useful to the other entities as well, even though you may not have the entire chain in your hands at that point.
Yeah, I can tell you, in speaking to exchanges, I think before this, a lot of them didn't necessarily realize that some of the entities they're working with aren't necessarily sourcing all the inventory directly from publishers. So this has been a great way for them to develop further insight too into the supply sourcing of the partners they work with.
Right. And the reason I like to highlight that is that once people understand the value that they're seeing with this information, now I'm hoping that they'll start mandating that information with their partners and so on. So hopefully we'll see a lot more adoption as time goes by.
Yeah, it's precisely why we, from our end, have begun mandating a requirement that we be sent this information. So, I mean, we see that support for the supply chain object is now in place for all the exchanges we're integrated with. The quality of information or the depth of information and completeness of information varies from case to case, but several months ago, we began requiring it, and we will trim we will cut intermediary supply sources if they are not presenting complete and accurate supply path information, because without that, we can't achieve what I described earlier, which is the desire to understand how the impression got all the way from the publisher to us.
Exactly. Cool. No, that's great to hear that you're enforcing that, and I do know it's. Different entities have different challenges in what they can do, but overall, I think just like every other standard, the more people adopt it, the easier it becomes to start enforcing that as well. If you go to the next slide.
Why don't you talk a little bit about Google and just the adoption picking up with them? I think that's an interesting point.
Yes, indeed. I think this is probably a couple of months ago, or maybe a month or so ago, where Google has started enforcing, has started requiring the ads.txt files to include all the intermediaries. The publishers should start providing that, and that, in my mind at least, ties into the fact that you now have access to that information, right? So it basically is a signal that they're starting to see a lot more adoption of supply chain object, which allows for that kind of an analysis to be completed. So yeah, definitely a lot of signals that adoption has reached a point of has reached that critical mass, if you will, which brings us to why we've been focusing on that at Pixalate around this topic. And just to just take a step back, the original intent of supply chain object was around yield optimization, right? So basically, look at all the different supply paths, try to eliminate duplicate hops and things like that. But what we're doing is a slightly different twist to it. We're using that to analyze the traffic patterns, to look at your traffic and look at it from the point of view of IVT and ad fraud, right? So basically, I like to say, this is a feature that we introduced in our analytics dashboard, where we can look at all your traffic. Now you can do that through the lens of the supply chain object, right? So basically understand the implications of the supply chain on your traffic. And the kind of things that we're talking about, and I'll talk to this in a second, but basically you can use the supply chain object in a whole lot of different ways, right? So look at the path, look at the different hops involved, look at which what the entry points are, things like that, and provide a simple visualization within that dashboard. And the benefits on the next slide are really straightforward. It's really about securing your supply chain, right? So making sure that you're working with trusted partners, you're making sure that your inventory quality is at the levels that you'd like to be. And that basically has doesn't mean that you just chop off paths that may not be working. It's also a question of working with those different partners if you're so inclined, to make sure that they understand challenges that are coming through those paths. And then, of course, the tool also allows you to to enforce your the basic concepts around looking for arbitrage points in the supply paths, try to reduce costs and so on. And the thing that I'm probably the most excited about is the fact that you can now look at, you can use this data to find potential fraud schemes, right? So especially for us, and this is the reason why I'm hoping that we'll see more and more adoption of the supply chain object, is that the more data we have, we can now analyze the data, apply intelligence to see other potential fraud schemes as well.
Yeah, I mean, I could give you a couple examples of specific ways this information is helping us. We have seen cases where we can plainly see that there's some type of fraud going on, and it has some specific unique signature that gives it away. Now, let's say we see this in an account that is directly on an exchange that we're integrated with. Okay, so we can block it. We can talk to the exchange about it, and it's gone, right? Well, it isn't, because of the indirection of the supply chain. So whoever that bad actor is, they will often work with other entities, some of those intermediaries who sit on the ad exchange. So we'll see the same signature of fraud leak back in through the indirect paths, because those indirect paths, they're sourcing supply from the same bad guy. And before supply chain, there was no way for them to provide us any insight into where they get their traffic from. So there isn't a lot of choice that we had in that case. If a business sort of had a mixed model of sourcing traffic directly from publishers, but also sourcing it from other intermediaries, and we saw evidence of some fraudulent behavior, it's a baby in bathwater situation. We had to toss the whole thing. Supply chain gives us the ability to examine which of their underlying sources are the problem and take action on that, which is a great improvement. Another scenario where this becomes helpful is a lot of interesting things show up when you look at viewability by supply path. So I can tell you, for example, there's some companies that provide sort of supplementary inventory opportunities for publishers, and maybe like comment sections or sidebar widgets or things like that. Some of these are perfectly fine. However, some of them have some questionable properties. For example, auto-refreshing ads indefinitely, regardless of user activity, including if the browser tab is open in the background. And that results in inventory with nearly 0% viewability, which I would consider borderline fraud, but definitely very poor quality and not worth buying. Now, the thing is, when you don't consider the supply paths, it looks like that site overall has a very poor viewability rate, which is going to reflect quite badly on that site. However, when you pivot it by supply paths, what you can find out is that, well, actually, maybe the inventory directly from the publisher is perfectly fine, but the inventory coming through particular selling entities has this incredibly low viewability. If you pivot again, what you probably find is everything that passes through that company has that property. It's not limited to just the one domain. So it provides a lot more ability to analyze, slice and dice, and understand the root cause of quality concerns and identify that, instead of tarring and feathering the publisher whose domain is being used in the bid requests.
Yeah, just rather than make a blanket statement about that publisher, you're now able to be more nuanced, if you will. Right. And so on the next slide, Calvin. So this kind of I know this not exactly visible what we're talking about here, but the idea really is that you can now look at the analytics dashboard and break it down by the full path, right? So basically, the left half of the screen that you see here is basically the path that the traffic has been taking. And then on the right side, you see all the normal analytic, the metrics that we provide, whether it is the total total number of impressions, the viewability information, the IVT, all those things are available on the right side. And the idea being, you can now you're now thinking about it from the point of view of the path. And to Ian's point, you can also look at it from the point of view of the entry points, right? So basically, from any publisher, you can look at the different entry points and look at the implications of that entry point to IVT and other things. And then there are a number of other set of features that we included, things like looking at it from the point of view of hops, right? So are there specific hops that are potentially causing problems? Another interesting use case that I know Ian is itching to really work on is looking at entities regardless of where they are in the supply chain, right? So are those potential causes of IVT or fraud and so on? So there is a whole range of things that you're able to get to by using this information and really apply that to your ad quality, your traffic quality. And I think that I have one more slide, I think, on the on the next slide, basically try to talk about the is important. Is also the completeness is something that I think is important to understand, right? So impact of completeness of the chain. So if the chain is not complete, does that translate to a higher amount of IVT and so on? This part of it is so right now what we're doing is just looking at the supply chain object itself, but the plan is to apply, go to the next level in short order, where we will also look at the integrity of that information, right? So basically, not just the completeness, but also check whether is the information really realistic or not. If somebody, for example, if somebody is claiming to be a direct, according to the supply chain, claiming to be a direct seller, but the ads.txt file does not reflect that. That is one of those things that would be able to take a look at as well. So on the next slide, I think basically I wanted to kind of emphasize that there are a whole range of different use cases that we're looking at. The compliance to the supply path policies is a big one, I think, right? So basically, to Ian's point, they want to. I think that Basis has been good about enforcing the length of the supply paths. But even if you do have a policy around it, you want to really look at the traffic, make sure that those policies are really being followed through or not, right? So look at the supply path, the length and other aspects to it. Validation is something that I talked about a little bit, but in terms of just looking at the integrity of the data. And then, of course, the other thing that I didn't put in here is also looking at it from the point of view of compliance information, right? So privacy is something that's becoming more and more important in our industry. And if you're able to look at the supply paths in terms of adherence to the different privacy policies, that's going to be something that would be useful as well. So there are a whole range of things that we can do with this functionality. Ian, anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, fraud doesn't just sort of happen by accident, and up until now, a lot of the sort of anti-fraud approaches have been dependent on just looking at the impression level, or sort of trying to filter out, without thinking about how supply is sourced, trying to filter out impressions that seem to be bad. I mean, this is inherently leaky. You can only detect, you only know what you know. You can only detect, you're not going to be able to technologically detect every novel way of generating invalid traffic. Knowing where it comes from is ultimately, a very long-term, robust way of protecting supply quality, in addition to that inventory filtering. But fraud comes from somewhere. It doesn't just happen by magic. It's somebody is doing it, and figuring out and identifying the somebody, instead of just trying to sift out the fraud from the fire hose of inventory that arrives to you, is, in my view, a much smarter way to go about it.
Absolutely. I guess on the next slide, we are we are looking at putting together some reports based on the data that we collect across the industry. But we wanted to kind of present some initial findings here, just to kind of whet that appetite, right? So one of the interesting things that we thought that we felt was interesting, at least, was that the length of the supply chain did seem to impact IVT within the data that we saw. So going from, if you go from 2 to 3 hops, for example, it seems to have increased it by 17%. And then as you go through 4 hops, it seems to have increased it by 75%. Now, I want to be clear that that doesn't mean that the length is the only vector in terms of fraud, and there are a lot of good reasons to have a long supply chain, like to Ian's point earlier about helping the tools that help smaller publishers monetize their traffic is a great one, where you really need that extra hop. But it is something that I wanted to kind of mention about at least the importance of really looking at your supply chain. Another thing that we thought was interesting was the data completeness, right? So the point that the couple of slides ago when I talked about the incomplete paths, seemed like there was a increase in 71% when it goes through incomplete paths. That kind of seems logical, but I'm curious how that'll play out over time when we start, everyone starts enforcing the supply paths too. A third side, which is probably less interesting in some ways, but directly from a point of IVT, but still interesting, is the length of the hops for different platforms, right? So the desktop web was clearly a longer. The number of hops is definitely more. CTV is less. I thought that was interesting because it kind of reflects where we are from a maturity point of view, right? So CTV is still a newer form of media in so many ways, and might be more direct sold in many cases. But I think this trend is something that we should be looking at over time. I think that even CTV is going to start having more hops as well.
Yeah, and I have a few thoughts about all this. So as Ahmed alluded to be clear, it is absolutely not the case that there is a causal relationship that more hops causes more fraud, because fraud is caused by somebody. Just having more hops doesn't make there be more fraud. But my hypothesis about this, well, a few things. First, the more indirection in the supply chain, the more opportunity there is for bad actors to slide their way in. For a fairly detailed explanation of this, see the Ad Exchanger article I wrote called the risks of secondhand inventory that sort of illustrates this. But the major exchanges have a pretty good sense of inventory quality and are not going to allow particularly untrustworthy companies to use their exchange. Right. However, they may be able to find smaller players who hold an account on that exchange, who are less discriminating or less aware, and be able to sell through them. And add a few more hops to this, and you get this indirection where nobody actually thinks they're complicit in piping fraud into the ecosystem, and yet it still happens. Also, I think that, so this is declared information, right? So when it's incomplete, somebody hasn't declared the necessary information. I would not be surprised if the companies with a greater commitment to traffic quality are more likely to have shorter chains because they're paying attention, and chains declared complete because they're paying attention, right? And paying attention tends to lead to less fraud because you see things that are bad and you stop them. Also, this number of hops, CTV versus desktop, I think that helps get to the point, which is that fraud can be caused by bad actions from the publisher side. It can be caused by intermediaries. We know, and Pixalate has talked about this before, there's a significant amount of fraud happening in the CTV space. A lot of it is happening at the publisher. Fake publishers, or, well, they're real business entities, but the channels that they publish may not actually have the viewership that they claim to. And so I think that just goes to illustrate that there are two components to look at. There's the fraudulent actions coming from the publisher, and there's the fraudulent actions coming from the intermediaries. And CTV might have a shorter supply chain at present, but there are still fraudulent actions coming from the publishers that need to be addressed. But the good news is those are already being addressed.
Cool. Now, 100% agree with that. I think that's all we have right now for as far as our prepared content goes. Calvin, do we have any questions that? Calvin, you're on mute.
I'm sorry. Thank you, panel. I appreciate that. Was a good explanation on the topic. Let's go ahead and take some time for questions. Just a reminder to everyone that's on, be sure to type your question into the box in the control panel. We look like we have a few already. We'll go through those, but continue to add those as we have, a good 10, 15 minutes left in the webinar we can stay on. Okay, so the first question, it says, it seems this solution is only as good as the label inside the .text. I'm assuming as .text and JSON files. Therefore, if a site are intentionally mislabeled, then would it slip past the validation?
So it depends on the scenario. It sounds like maybe we're talking about ads.txt and sellers JSON instead of the supply chain object per se. But all of these standards provide for declared information, okay? The information that a bad actor is going to declare is probably going to be untrue. But if an entity is untrustworthy, my advice is do not buy that traffic, okay? So sometimes there's a a tendency to look at some of these developments and say, well, here's this edge case where it would be possible to abuse. Let's not let perfect be the enemy of good here. It's a really wildly complicated and messy industry, and so we kind of have to start simple to get any traction on anything. But keep in mind, the information from an untrustworthy entity, I don't need it to be accurate to still have value here. So, the exchanges we work directly with, I have a great deal of confidence in the accuracy of what they declare in their sellers JSON files, for example, and the way they process supply chain objects. Many of the intermediaries they source traffic from are likewise well-acting entities that want to provide us supply chain visibility into where they got traffic from. That additional hop alone from entities that I can trust is more than enough to provide a great deal of value. Now, it could be that a hop further back, it's an untrustworthy entity, and I probably shouldn't trust what they're saying, but I don't need to, because I've now got the additional information from the second hop entity that points to that third hop entity that I don't trust. And at that point, it doesn't even matter what that further hop is saying, right? But there's various cross-validation opportunities. So there's cross-referencing you can do between ads.txt and sellers JSON and supply chain objects to help identify inconsistencies or implausible information. Some of those are identified in the IAB FAQs for this. As well, there has been some talk of cryptographically signing the supply chain object. I believe this is happening as part of the ads.cert effort. I would say, and this is my personal opinion, the reason these two things have been dealt with separately is because it's actually really complicated to do the signing in a way that can actually work across the diverse way that ad inventory is sold. It's technologically very challenging. So first thing first, provide the avenue for the information to be supplied, and then follow as fast as possible with provide a way for it to be signed so you can be absolutely certain of its accuracy. But in the meantime, having the option to receive the declared information and being able to use various techniques to detect anomalies is still a massive improvement in transparency.
I do want to glom onto that. One of the points you made there, Ian, about the incomplete chains, or how confident can you be about the information that you're getting. I think it does come down to, and this is where there's not you can never look at all this data as just a blanket statement of right or wrong, right? So you have to basically really understand your traffic, really understand your who you're doing business with as well. So if you know, let's say for example, the incomplete chain path, right? So if you have a bunch of transactions that are incomplete, if you are confident about the entity that you are that's at the top of that chain, that if they are if that's an entity that is doing its due diligence in many other ways, then you can potentially continue to use that traffic. So there are, again, going back to Ian's point about don't let perfect be the enemy of good, it is something that you can actually use, I think, and take. Again, it is really up to each business to decide what they're comfortable with, right? So use the data is really the bottom line. Use what's available.
That's great. Thank you both. That was, I think, a good explanation. Second question is, and it's a two-part question. I'll ask the first and then, well, I'll ask the whole thing and you guys can answer it. But the plan to add supply chain validation is at the pre-bid level. Is that correct? Or is it part of the whole?
So I think the probably the two aspects to that. One is checking the information in supply chain object and comparing it with the seller.json, and I guess, and second part is the ads.txt, right? So basically being able to do those kind of cross checks is what I was referring to, at least on that slide.
Okay, and then does it add any latency? What's the overhead on that? Is the second part of that question on the validation?
So for this purpose over here, it's really post impression analytics, right? So you're basically looking at the reports after the transaction, and then you can take decisions based on that for your future transactions. So what we're doing here definitely does not add latency. But if you were to apply it in real time, then I think we'd have to think through exactly what the implications would be.
Okay. Next question. This is a little bit of a loaded question. I'm not sure we'll be able to answer it, but can you give an example of how a publisher provides IVT?
Well, yeah, absolutely. One way is just by loading ads that can never actually be seen. Another way is intentionally disguising the way or the source, the actual domain that the ads are running on. So for example, it's not uncommon for piracy websites to use a technique of like nesting multiple iframes to sort of launder traffic through an innocent looking site, but actually show the ads on a piracy site. A publisher could also engage in abusive auto-refreshing practices. So for example, if the ad units are set to refresh every 10 seconds with no regard for whether there's any user activity or whether the ad is in view or any of those things, you can create a scenario where the vast majority of ad impressions are completely impossible to ever be seen by a human and thus have zero value. So there's a lot of ways to, and of course the classic one would be buying traffic. Right now, traffic acquisition is despite how it tends to be viewed as sort of a dirty thing to do. Publishers are like I would be surprised if there's many publishers who aren't buying traffic in some way or another. Now, buying traffic runs the gamut from things like advertising the site on Facebook, or through like content recommendation widgets, which tends to be sort of the relatively clean approach to buying and traffic to the site, all the way down to vendors of, we'll get people to your site for less than a penny per 1,000 visits, and don't ask too many questions about how human those people are, or that sort of thing. So that might just be outright bot traffic that's being acquired. So a lot of ways that it could be upstream of the publisher.
Right, and I should say a lot of these definitions are really part of the IVT guidelines from MRC, tag, IB, and all that. So it is possible to detect a lot of these kind of traffic as well.
Okay, is that just something that's on the IAB site? You can, as part of the, can you point people at that?
Yeah, I think is there on. I've seen it across all the sites. I don't remember exactly which one is.
Research for it, though, you'd be able to find it. Okay. Sorry.
Definitions of types of invalid traffic. I think the Media Rating Council is the source of the definitions, but I'd have to double check.
Right.
Yeah, I believe you're correct on that. On specifics of how they're, at least how we monitor them, how we should look at them. through our accreditations. Okay, so next, the next question is, can the panelists speak to the argument that at least some aspects of fraud are baked into the media costs, noting that it is an auction after all?
If that's the view that the people are bidding and buying inventory under the expectation that a percent of it is fraudulent and discounting what they're willing to pay for it accordingly, that might be the case. But I mean, I don't think that we should just accept and endorse that that's just the way it is, right? We should be trying to minimize fraud to the fullest extent possible. So whether or not people are sort of pricing that in, it's still, there's a moral imperative, I think, to do something about it. Also, more often, I think you hear this sort of argument from like very strictly direct response oriented advertisers. You might hear them say, well, I don't really think about fraud because all I care about is my CPA. So if there's fraud, my CPA will be bad. There is absolutely fraudulent traffic that will manage to fake a conversion event. It depends on what the conversion event is. But for example, a form fill on a lead form, there are bots that can absolutely fake that. I've seen precisely that happen, where there's apparently a high conversion rate. When you go look at the data, it's actually filling out the form with fake email addresses. Something that appears like a hard metric, like conversions, can in some cases be gamed, but also brand marketers don't often have such a clear-cut, even if we ignore the possibility of gaming performance metrics, brand marketers often don't have clear-cut performance metrics, which makes them especially susceptible to fraud. Yeah, I mean, it's probably priced in to some extent. It's harder for some types of marketers to price it in than others, and I don't think we should, accept it regardless.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I think maybe this is an idealistic point of view, but I think it is natural for people to. I think it is important for people to understand that there is going to be fraud, but that doesn't mean that they need to accept it, right? They got to make sure that they're using as much, that they're really looking at what's going on, that they are applying the tools that they can get their hands on to fight it. That I think is the bottom line.
Great, thank you. A couple more questions. And I think you touched on this a little bit, and so maybe we don't have to look at it that closely, but do longer supply paths cause fraud? I know you kind of mentioned that earlier, but maybe dive into that just for 1 minute.
Yeah, so longer supply paths do not cause fraud, but they enable bad activity to hide more easily. So you're more likely to find it on long supply paths because of the opportunity for abuse. That said, you will find long supply paths that are as clean as a direct path. It all depends on the supply sourcing standards that are being applied or by the parties in this path. And the longer the path, the more likely you're going to find parties who are a little bit loose about their supply sourcing standards.
Right. Yeah, I have nothing else to add there. Understand your path and take decisions based on that.
Yeah, so that's, our general view is we don't want to see more than 2 hops away from us. We'll allow the exchange, exchange working directly with the publisher is ideal to us. Like I said, we see the value of some types of intermediaries. So exchange working with an intermediary who works directly with the publisher, that's also fine. Beyond that, we generally don't accept that traffic. There may be certain case-by-case exceptions where it makes sense, but I'm reminded of having a conversation with somebody on my team where she used to be a category buyer in lighting for a home improvement chain, and I asked her, what does the supply chain look like? Because those are physically light bulbs that need to get to specifically Turkey. In every case, it's 1 or 2 hops. And this is a physical thing that needs to be shipped from China to, in this case, Turkey. How is it that we're selling ones and zeros on the internet, and yet for some reason we need 4, 5, 6 hop supply paths to get that from one party to another? We just don't, in my opinion. So while there is valid role for intermediaries, once you have intermediaries reselling to other intermediaries, I really, really start to question what the necessity for that is.
I think it's a good analogy. Amit, anything else on that, or you good?
No, I think we covered that this topic for a good bit.
So just it looks like two more questions. Is there a utopia where fraud is eliminated, and with the various types of fraud?
Now, I think that Ian has kind of answered that to a certain degree. There are so many different types of fraud that it's. I think it's one of those things where we have to keep fighting fraud where we see it, and make it more and more difficult for the fraudsters to get to us. And I think a pretty interesting picture that this is a discussion I was having back at Tech Lab with some of the folks who are working on ads.cert, and really the idea we're talking about how you have this whole chain, right, and then you try to push things further and further down the path, make it more and more difficult to do the easy things, and then get it down to the more difficult things. So that I think is the way we fight fraud. I don't know if we get to the utopia or not, but things like supply chain, things like ads.cert, all of these, and ads.txt, all these are things we should help fight that fraud.
Yeah, and that's why I use that paradigm of sort of publisher-initiated versus intermediary-initiated fraud. The publisher-initiated fraud is always going to exist as an opportunity. Now, existing fraud detection and blocking tools are pretty well suited already to detecting, this impression is a bot or things like that. But without further insight, what we can't figure out is whether it's actually coming from the publisher or if it's coming from bad traffic inserted by an intermediary. So addressing that intermediary issue is been, I think, a priority for the industry over the years, even if it maybe hasn't been expressed in this sort of paradigm by a lot of people. In the time I've been in the industry, we've gone from a world in which unwanted browser add-ons, toolbars can inject ad slots into web pages like Facebook, sell that inventory on exchanges, and there's nothing whatsoever to stop that from happening, even though Facebook is in no way involved and does not allow or endorse it. We've gone from that being rampant to a scenario where it's actually relatively hard to outright spoof inventory or sell inventory, at least without getting the endorsement of the domain via an ads.txt file. Now, like I said, there's still some avenues for abuse, but it's improved dramatically. And so this intermediary originated fraud is definitely shrinking. I've also watched the fraud be chased from existing formats which mature and develop excellent tools for addressing various types of fraud into the emerging format. So I've watched it flow from web, where those sorts of things were rampant, and then things like ads.txt started clamping down on that, and robust fraud detection from various vendors, including Pixalate. See that move to mobile app, where there was one point in time in which there was a widely held opinion that you couldn't fake mobile app traffic. How would you automate a mobile app? Now, obviously, that's now we can look back at that and say that's a ridiculous idea. But the fraud started to shift to that more poorly lit mobile app environment with things like app ads.txt for mobile app and better detection and handling of mobile scenarios. We're seeing it flow to the CTV environment now. So whenever there's an opportunity to make money, there will through fraud, somebody will always want to exploit it. But we can always strive to make continuous improvements and plug as many holes as we can. It's ultimately a human nature problem, and humans are really, really inventive. So I don't think there's a utopia in which it'll be literally impossible to do any type of fraud, because humans are incredibly capable of inventing new ways to cheat. But we can sure try and make it as hard as possible.
Indeed.
Well said, well said. One last one. Are there other uses for the supply chain object you guys can comment on?
There's some really interesting reporting things you can hypothetically do. So you can start to look at aggregating up reporting by, because a given publisher, for example, might hold accounts across many exchanges. So you can think about producing a report now that aggregates by that publishing company and then shows you the performance and cost by various different supply paths, right? So there's lots of interesting reporting applications you can do as well.
Yeah. And I guess the one that I'm looking forward to is also looking at things like, I like the fact that we've gone from looking at it purely from a yield optimization point of view to looking at ad fraud and IVT with this release. I think that there is potential similarly to look at it from the privacy and privacy compliance related topics as well. So that's something that I'm definitely looking forward to.
That's great. Well, it looks like we've covered all of our questions. Is there anything else the two of you want to cover before we wrap up?
I'll go first. I think the two things. I think there are. This is me probably putting my tech lab hat back on. I think it's really, really important for people to work on these kind of transparency standards, right? So, getting the adoption going is critical and allows for additional solutions like what we have here to be built and be useful to the industry. And I say that for both the supply chain object, but also look at ad structure. That I think is a big one that everyone should be paying attention to.
Yeah, and the analytics solutions that Pixalate has built here are immensely useful for us in shifting from what was manual, ad hoc, sort of complicated or painful queries to analyze the supply chain information, to having it all nicely and automatically presented. But there's a lot of exciting further evolution that can happen with this data that we've only begun to scratch the surface on. So keep an eye on this, because I think there'll be lots of interesting and exciting new things to follow.
Well, great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Amit. We appreciate everyone being here. Just a reminder to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Lots of great videos, reports, and a variety of different content there. We also publish reports on a regular basis, specifically around CTV and mobile, and the different app stores. We also have a pretty robust blog series, so if you have any information you'd like to know about the blogging from us, go check that out. Thank you once again for joining us, and we will see everybody next time, which will probably be next year. Happy holidays and Happy New Year.
Thanks all.
Yeah.